Greetings of the day, everyone. I am privileged to welcome you all into the third edition of Orange City Literature Festival, organized by SGR Knowledge Foundation in association with GH Raisoni University, powered by Raisoni Group of Institutions. I am Himanshi Gandhari, delighted to be your anchor for today's session. How to make the world better for everyone by Mr. Arun Maira in conversation with Advocate Karthik Shukul. And I believe you are going to cherish the topic as well as I hope you are going to enjoy yourselves. But before that, I would like to take a moment to introduce you with our guest of today's session. Mr. Arun Maira was part of Tata Administrative Service for 25 years and worked at various important positions in the Tata Group till 1989. He was the CEO of Tata Industries from 1977 to 1979 in Malaysia. He was a board member of Tata Motors from 1981 to 1989. He was resident director from 1981 to 1986 and executive director in the corporate office from 1987 to 1989. He played a key part in Tata Motors' successful entry in the light commercial vehicle segment. After leaving the Tata Group, he worked with Arthur D. Little in the US for 10 years, where he was leader of the Global Strategy and Organization Practice and Managing Director of Innovation Associates. In 2000, he returned to India and held the position of chairman of Boston Consulting Group till April 2008. He served as a member of India's Planning Commission from 2009 to 2014. He's a thought leader and an author of several books on organization and societal change. He has served on the boards of several companies, civil society organizations, and education institutions. Presently, he is the chairman of Helpage International. It's an honor to have you with us, Mr. Arun Maira, and this gets even more delightful as we have Advocate Karthik Shukul, who will be in conversation with him as the moderator. Now, I would like to welcome the moderator, Advocate Karthik Shukul. With 14 years of experience in litigating writ petitions and relevant legal and arbitration matters for a diverse clientele, both as principal advocate and also as a member of litigation team, Advocate Karthik Shukal sir is city's leading advocate. He has regular appearances before the Honorable Bombay High Court, the Honorable Supreme Court, the National Green Tribunal, the National Company Law Tribunal Bombay, and other tribunals and forums. Apart from litigation, there is a separate office dedicated to land and property laws. Apart from this, he is also celebrated a guest lecturer at various institutions like Judicial Officers Training Institute Nagpur, Maharashtra Judicial Academy Mumbai, to name a few. He is also a member, state level committee, drafting of guidelines from man-animal conflict, state of Maharashtra, and has received the Century Asia Wildlife Service Award 2017. I welcome you, sir. Also, before moving ahead, I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the support of Penguin Publisher as the association is valuable to Orange City Literature Fest. Dear audience, you are about to experience a conversation between two very dynamic individuals. So without skipping a moment, I humbly invite Advocate Karthik Shukul to lead us ahead.
Thank you so much, Himakshi. At the outset, I must say that it's an absolute pleasure to be having a conversation with the illustrious erudite Arun Maira. And as I was mentioning to him a little while earlier, I hope this, I desperately wish that this was in person. But given the times that we are living in today, this is unfortunately the only possible option. Having said that, let's make the best of what we have today. And let's try and make the best of the little time that we have with this illustrious personality. So Arun, if I may just start off by saying, what is it that ticked writing to begin with? Considering we are in a lit fest here, what is the first thing that got you interested into writing?
Thank you very much, Karthik. It's such a pleasure to be asked that question, and more than that, to have this opportunity to be in a discussion with you. And I'm grateful to the Orange City Literature Festival for giving us this occasion. And yes, it'll have to be like this, talking to each other through technology. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. It enables us to talk. You're a busy person. You wouldn't have been able to meet with me so easily if we had to come and meet physically. So here we are. So why do I write? What made me write? I, well, used to write essays in school and write to pass exams and did quite well actually in writing English particularly. But that's not what the sort of writing we are talking about now. It was in the 1990s when I left India for a while to be in consulting in the United States that I was invited by Business India, the journal in India, to write once a month for them from there about what I was observing about India from there, from a distance, as it were, my reflections, as well as what I was learning in the United States, which I felt might be useful for me and my people back in India. So it was, monthly writing 800 to 1,000 words. But that compelled me to sort of put big thoughts down into very short spaces, into a few words. And so that's when you come to the art of writing. And you must have an idea, something that you want to convey, but that doesn't make you a writer. You need to be able to write it well. So since then, I have been writing articles, journals, began to write books while I was in the United States, and learned that firstly, you must have an idea. That's the most important thing. Without an idea, you could be like I was in school, a great sort of writer of language and good grammar and right words, but that didn't make what I wrote useful or interesting to anybody else. So the idea and then the craft of writing, the craft of writing. So I just enjoy it. So I read a lot, I listen to a lot of people, I meet a lot of people, and it makes me think. So the thinking then is the idea. Some idea comes, and I want to express it to myself. What have I learned? What have I gathered? And I find that then trying to write it down in, say, 1,000 words forces me to think very clearly of what is necessary to be said and what need not be said to shorten it. And so I have been, since even before I went to the States, writing poetry, haiku poetry. Now, haiku is a Japanese form of poetry in which you have to express an idea in 17 syllables only. And they're very profound thoughts, philosophical thoughts, and you got to put them down in 17 syllables. So in the background, while I was writing for business journals and writing my books, I continued to write haiku. So it was the craft of writing, but in haiku, you first have to have a very profound idea and then keep, chiseling away till you can get it down into 17 syllables. So that's why I write, and that's what I'm still learning about how to write.
That's wonderful. And haiku again is one art form that really not many people can pick up easily. And for you to do it without any, am I right that there is no professional training in your background? Right. So, and I'm aware that apart from your all critically acclaimed books, there's also a poetry book that you've written. We'll talk about that a little later.
Mhm.
But may I just, with that segue, venture into the two specific books that I would like to personally talk about right now. A Billion Fireflies, critical conversations to shape a new post-pandemic world, something that is on the top of the mind of everyone today, because we had very grave expectations of where this would lead us, the pandemic would lead us. And I feel that your book is really an eye opener in the sense that it gives a fairly clear idea of how things can progress henceforth. So, can we talk about that before we go to the next one?
Sure, sure. Thank you. Yes, so this is the book, yes, A Billion Fireflies, Critical Conversations to Shape a New Post-Pandemic World. In March 2020, it's almost 2 years now, the economy of India hit a big roadblock. Actually, the economies of all countries in the world had hit a roadblock because of COVID. And here we were, a big economy, Indian economy, with 1 billion+ people traveling along, and lives were being improved, some people more than others, but there was progress, there was development, and the economy hit a big roadblock. So it's like all of us Indians were traveling in a big bus, which was, moving, and everyone in the bus. And then came this roadblock. Now, when the roadblock stopped the bus, I'm talking now of March 2020, when there was a lockdown declared, suddenly many of us noticed, all of us noticed, so many Indians falling off and walking on the roads, on the highways, looking for a place, some shelter, some place to get some water, some food. Where were these Indians? All the time that we were traveling in this big bus and the GDP is what we kept worrying about, its pace of growth, we didn't realize that so many people were clinging onto this bus. They were clinging to the outside, they were clinging to the roof, and we were traveling inside the bus. And in the bus, there were the person driving the bus, a driver, and he had instrument panel before him, which was a GDP meter and another meter called, I call it the stochometer. And behind was the first class section of the bus, where there were people who were traveling in more luxurious seats and safety belts and equipment for themselves, and they were being served as they traveled French wine, Swiss cheese, good food, and they were traveling around in this bus. In the back part of the bus, the larger part of the bus, there were many people also traveling in the bus, and they were also in seats with some safety equipment for them, but not so comfortable. And they were also served food, which was like packed sandwiches and Coca-Colas occasionally, but they had food. And neither of these people, sets of people, were aware that there were all these others outside this formal bus. And so when the bus stopped, all these people were clinging onto the bus, fell off. And then we said, my goodness, we didn't know there were Indians in our own country who lived like this. So that was a shock to many people. And that compelled many people to think again. And because we were in lockdown, the only way we could connect with each other was through webinars and Zoom conferences. And my goodness, the numbers started to proliferate. But thank goodness that we had the technology and we could start listening to each other. What's going on in your mind? What do you think should be done? And so on. So many conversations began to happen with more depth to them. And those are the critical conversations that I began to listen to and which I have recorded the essence of in this book. And those conversations were about that whenever the bus is going to move again, we must not go back to traveling like we were. We would have to redesign the bus and travel differently, with more compassion for everybody on the bus or clinging onto the bus. We said that. We said that. We have to not just build back, but build something new and build better. Now, I noticed also as the conversations went on, month after month, and a few months ago this year, before the second wave hit us, we thought India was out of it and we could start building the economy again. And the conversations that were happening before the budget of last year, a year ago, were about, how soon would the GDP start building up to get to 5 trillion? So we were back talking about the same old bus that we were traveling in and looking at those two instrument meters you see in front. There's the GDP meter, which was being used, and the people just behind the driver of the bus were the people who were able to afford the better seats in the front, the wealthier people, and who were urging, you got to put your foot on the accelerator and get the GDP growing again. And there was another instrument that these people particularly were looking at, which I call the Stocker market meter. It's like an RPM meter. And they also kept an eye to say, I hope that is in the right zone. And so just the two instruments to gauge whether the economy is doing well. I had come back to India after my 10 years in the United States in 2000, and I had been away all the years since 1991 when the liberalization had enabled the growth of India to really pick up, and it had picked up. When I came back in 2020, I saw two cartoons by Lakshman, R.K. Lakshman, the famous cartoonist, on the front pages of Times of India. Many I saw, but I recollect these two. The first of them showed a big minister arriving in his helicopter to some dirty village, rural village, and in which there are little people in their dhotis bowing before the minister, and he is shouting at them. He says, when we've given you cell phones, why do you keep asking for drinking water? Don't you want to progress? Now, Karthik, today in India, we say we've got the second largest number of people with smartphones and cheapest and so on. And we are the most water-stressed country in the world. I know your concern and care for the environment, and you know this well. So what is progress, and how do you measure progress? Right? The second cartoon showed two beggars at the bottom of the stock exchange in Bombay, and down the stairs are coming 2 or 3 brokers and fat chaps, and looking very happy. And one beggar telling the other at the bottom of the stairs, oh, good, the BSE must have gone up. Now the world is going to be good for us. Where is the connection between the stock market and the lives of people? So here we are. We are talking now in 2021, in the month of November. Again, people in the front of the bus are still worrying about the stock market. It's booming. It is hitting records everywhere in the world. But what's happened to all the people who were traveling very poorly in the bus even before the pandemic and have fallen right off? Are we concerned about what the shape of the bus, the shape of the economy should be to enable everyone to travel safely and as well as the environment to be protected? This bus shouldn't put so much pressure on the earth as it has been doing. So those were the conversations that came out. And I put into this book the forces that have been shaping the world for 30, 40 years, very largely. Two of them are capitalism, the idea that, capitalism is the way to progress and to grow economies. And in capitalism, property rights, and you're a lawyer, is sort of 9/10 of it, that, it's good to give people ownership of property and for them to feel their property is protected. So that's what drives it. Property rights is the thesis for creating laws and economic institutions. At the same time, democracy says that human rights have to be protected. So human rights means whose rights? It could be a rich man, it could be a poor man with no money, the beggar at the bottom of the stock exchange. Everyone's rights are to be equally protected. Now, in a capitalist enterprise like a company, a limited liability company, it's fair that somebody who owns, say, 1,000 shares should have 1,000 times the size of the vote of someone who owns only one share. It's fair because you own more. Whereas in democracy, every person, woman, man, old, young, poor, rich, Muslim, Hindu, every beating heart has one vote. Now, the principles of governance, the designs of institutions are different. And the crisis that's come in the whole world, in the United States, in Europe, is this conflict between democracy and capitalism. Whose rights are to be protected? The people who own or the people who need and vote? And this is the crisis of India. This crisis has been caused, since we talk of the environment, by also the earth being destroyed. By what? By new technologies that we human beings have invented. Very powerful technologies which enabled us. Steam engines, then internal combustion engines, and all sorts of ways of using energy to make our lives easier and growth, economic growth more. As well as other technologies. So technology has helped progress to happen. But who owns the technologies? Okay. Again, if you say it's the property right of somebody to own the technology, so those people who have the intellectual property rights today, They own the technology and they determine to whom they will sell it, at what price it will be sold. So we're facing it now with the vaccines. And the whole world is struggling to say, look, everybody needs a vaccine to make the whole world safe for everybody. But some rich companies who claim that they solely have contributed to the discovery of those vaccines, regardless of that government put money into the research institutions and so on. And they've been given legally the right to do what they want to with it, to license it if they so wish or not, and get royalties.
Absolute ownership, absolute complete ownership.
Absolutely, you see. So we came to that the people who had technologies earlier could produce better guns and better ships, use their technologies to take over the lands of people elsewhere, the colonization. Also, they started to convert human beings into property, taking human beings from where they were, like in Africa, as the property of enterprises in the United States, and they became the properties of enterprises, right? Of course, thank goodness we said that should not be done. But the knowledge that people have has also been converted to the property of rich corporations. So it's complete colonization. First colonization of lands, now colonization of minds and
Yeah.
ideas also. So we got to reframe. We got to reframe what life is about. We got to reframe for ourselves what would define a good life, a good society. What metrics? We have to do away with those two meters that we got on the front of the bus, the GDP meter and the stock market meter, and say what other instruments are we going to put there to gauge whether we are traveling well and everyone is safe and feeling equitably treated while we travel in the bus. So that's the essence of this book, Karthik.
Wonderful.
In that, I've given stories and examples of how solutions had been found and are being found, but we need to pay attention to those solutions and stop paying attention to, as I said, the old theories of progress and the old instruments that we got so fixated about to think that they are a good indicator of whether we are doing well.
Arun, I must confess, I've read, of course, extensively on the pandemic. I've uh, done extensive research on the pandemic. It is, of course, once in 100 years situation. And having read all of that, I must confess that the most insightful illustration that I have possibly ever heard is the one that I heard right now about the bus. It was it was putting it down to the most elementary form and making it putting it in such a palatable way. It's absolutely wonderful. Uh, with that, I would like to go on to the next book, The Solution Factory, a consultant's problem solving handbook. And if I may just ask you, what is it that made you write these books during the lockdown?
Yes, I wrote this book, The Billion Fireflies, which you just spoke about, because I felt the urge to do it. I felt that, we've had all these conversations, we'll forget about it. And as you know, as you're pointing out, yes, we are forgetting about it. It needs to be put down somewhere. So that urged me to very quickly start recording and at the time to do it because lockdown and to put it. And I got a publisher, it's an online publisher. There's new ways of publishing, which is very good, a Notion Press. And, within a week of my putting it down, it was out and available in America and England. Amazing how they do it now. My other book, The Solutions Factory, is Penguin, the largest and best publisher in the world. They had asked me before the pandemic actually, the lockdown started, to write a book which was called The Learning Factory, which I finished then during that time. And that was about what I learned while I was at Tata's, about how people can work together to create world-class enterprises to make India better. And that's what the Tata philosophy. It was not for the shareholders only, it was for the people of India. So I wrote that, but they already asked me that you write another one of what you did after Tata's, which while you were a consultant. So I had the time during the pandemic to keep picking out stories from my time as a consultant and put them into very readable form as stories. And therefore, this book is much easier to read. And students love it. The one that you just read, which you being a more thoughtful reader, probably read, people say this is a little more academic, but both have the same ideas, but told differently, told differently. In the Solutions Factory, I tell the story of what I learned when I came back to India about how India could progress. We need another model of leadership and another model of change. So that model, how was it discovered? It was discovered when I came back to India, and I mentioned to you that, we seem to have forgotten the poor people in our own country got so happy with our progress, the people on the top, that we need to ask all the people of India and listen to them and ask them, how is life for you? And what is it that you feel needs to change so that all of us can feel India's progressing well? So using my skill as a consultant, which is what a great consultant does, is to help people to understand themselves, to locate what they really care about most, and to find new strategies, new ways of getting something which otherwise seems impossible to get. So the art is to find a new way, not the way that everyone has been using and you have been using. Okay, you can be efficient at that, but you'll keep getting the same thing. If you want something very different, it has to be a new path, a new way. So I did in that book, I put down, which is in both the books, by the way, because those stories are so fundamental about the four models of change for large systems like India is. One of those models is, and these models are given as pictures, because when we finished that whole process, which took several months, we listened to, we means a few people, caring Indian citizens, some in government, but in their personal capacities, some like me as consultants, personal capacities, some were economists, but personal capacities. And we'd invited farm workers, we'd invited women who had, small enterprises, women who were teachers, students, lots of people listening to them. So hundreds and hundreds of people systematically are using my methods of consulting in this dialogue together. The outcomes were these four models of change and four ideas of what leaders are. And they were as pictures, produced as pictures. So I'm going to just describe the pictures to you in a few words each, if you don't mind, because it gives the essence.
Certainly.
So one picture was of big buffaloes in a pond. It's a hot day and there's a big pond and a lot of big buffaloes occupied the whole pond. And there's a little child waiting on the outside. He also wants to get cool in the pond or wants some water from the pond. And he's waiting for these buffaloes to, be done with it. And who are these buffaloes? These buffaloes are big netas. They are the people on the top who are given the positions to say, you sort it out and then life will be good for the rest of us. We are outside here waiting for the solution that you're going to find. And these big buffaloes, one fellow gets an idea to say, Arey, we should pay more attention to fast railways or something. He's a minister for that. And the other buffaloes say, no, 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 I think we should be pay attention to something else. And they can't make up their mind. So एक उठता है, बाकी उसको कहते हैं बैठ जाओ, फिर दूसरा उठता है, फिर कहते हैं you didn't cooperate with me, बैठ जाओ. So they're all not cooperating with each other, big chaps. And the people on the outside are waiting for progress. But we have this model that people who got big positions are the leaders. So that's one model of leadership. You must be up there, be given a big job and a big position. Now you're a leader. And the method of change is let the experts and the leaders make the plan and let them implement it. Doesn't work. So what India had done in 1991 was to say this model hasn't worked for India with the formal planning that we had done. Let's leave it to the market. So the second picture is of a big peacock in the middle of a courtyard, and around the peacock at some distance are some pigeons, and there's some grain scattered on the floor of the courtyard, and in the corner are hiding little sparrows. Now, the idea of opening up the economy, enabling people to have more opportunities, was that the little sparrows would get more opportunities and be able to eat. But when you throw open something and there are more opportunities, those who already have the means to take advantage of the opportunities means they already have some wealth and they can use the wealth to invest in the new opportunities. They'll make more wealth. Those who already have some high education can get a job in the new opportunities with higher salaries, right? And so they go even further up. Then you have the people who may have access to power because new rules are being made The people already have some power, access to power will get even more. So it's a process called cumulative causation. Okay, what you have will determine what you'll have next. Okay, so this force got loose in the country. And what has happened is that instead of the trickle down and all the sparrows eating quickly, the peacocks kept eating more and more and became big birds. And I noticed when I came back in 2000 that we were now in the newspapers, like the Times of India on page 3 behind Lakshman's cartoon, was the pictures of people, the parties that they went to in the Taj Hotel, Oberoi Hotel, the cars they came in, the clothes they wore, what wines they were drinking. My goodness. And this never used to happen in the India that I left in the 1980s. We weren't showing off wealth. There were wealthy people, but it was not good. It's not decent to just tell people I'm good because I'm wealthy and see how wealthy I am. So peacocks, but we call people who are wealthy the wealth creators. We must admire them, take their idea, ask them their opinion of how the economy should be run. We consider these as leaders of the economy. So second model. Third model was a model available to us in India, as we could see in the 2000s, was the whole Naxal movement in 1/3 of India, where there was violence, there was force being used, against the government and force being used on people to coerce them. And so this is the model of leadership. A person who has big force can force others to do things. And so this idea that we need strong leaders, authoritarian leaders, is always around. So that's a model of leadership. And the process of bringing change is make the others submit, and you can then produce large-scale change. Third model. All three models were visible in India simultaneously when I saw in 2000. We all saw it. We were still trying to plan because we need planning and government to do something. We were leaving it to the peacocks to somehow create wealth for everybody. And now they're called unicorns, of course. Make a lot of wealth personally for themselves and don't know what the benefit to the others is for a long time. And then third, you have, like we said, violence coming in. The violence is even creeping into our cities now. We've got a sort of urban violence, which we never used to have before. So this is a despondent model. But fortunately, because we were listening to what people on the ground were doing, we found that there was another model. There were small people, women, in their own villages, like Seva, this whole organization, who were making change, conditions for their own families and for their own communities. We found, like Amul, that example, that there were people who were just a buffalo or two buffaloes. They owned their own business, but they were part of a larger cooperative. And so this was another model of small people producing small change, and many such producing it, the world lights up. So we called it fireflies arising. These are leaders. They are doing something which is good for others and doing it with whatever resource they have. And if many more such fireflies arise in India, this model of change, the whole of India will light up equitably. So there were these 4 models of leaders and 4 models of process of change. The book Solutions Factory, I mean, this is like a culmination of an idea which we must build on now, was in every assignment that I did with any large organization in the United States or Europe or back in India, some of them, was to ask the people there, what is it that you want to do and create and why? And then what is it that you feel that you don't know how to do yet or don't have resource for yet, that you'd have to learn to do, So putting people onto a learning journey. So my whole consulting practice was about helping people to become faster learning organizations. And the learning has to be in you, by you, and you will apply the new learning that you get to take you further and further along towards this vision that you have of what you want to create in life. So it's told by many specific stories of manufacturing companies, technology companies, some NGOs, and also this culmination story of a whole country.
That's wonderful, Arun. My inherent predisposition as a lawyer is always one to have a solution-oriented approach. It therefore the topic of this conversation is, of course, how can we make the world a better place? So, if I may ask you, what it is that you think each of us must do, or more importantly, what we must learn to do in order to make this world a better place?
Karthik, we have to work together. That's very clear. Yes. And the problem, as we are noticing in COPE, is that countries are competing with each other. And there's no cooperation amongst the countries to say, unless we cooperate, we can't improve the world for everyone. I mean, the vaccine is not to do with the climate, but it's the similar problem that we have to be cooperating and helping each other. We can't be monopolizing resources for ourselves to say, I just want to keep making the world better for myself because I owe it to my family, my country, my citizens. We are all in the same boat and we must help each other. For the sake of our survival, that's one reason. The other is an ethical reason, that if you are going to live your life saying my life is all about only looking after myself and making more for myself, you're an unethical person. Every religion says this, that look after others, be compassionate and kind to others. Every spiritual tradition says this. But the laws that we have made, especially in the business sector, is that, well, economics, rational self-interest. In the business sector, that a company must look after its shareholders. I've served on the boards of many companies, and I could be legally sued if I made the company take a decision which immediately would not be best for the shareholders, for the next year or so, right? So what I'd learned in Tata's, from J.R.D. Tata's big thing saying, when he ever had to take a tough decision, he first thought about what's good for India and then what is good for Tatas. And if there was a dilemma that it appeared it'd be good for India but not for Tatas, he did what was good for India. And he says, lo and behold, after a few years, it was very good for Tatas also. So that ethical reasoning is very, very important. So that's one change that must come in all of us, to ask ourselves, for whom are we living? For whom are we doing what we are doing? And I'm afraid we don't. We judge ourselves also by how much more I've got, and others judge us also by how much more you got. So just change our own compass, one. Number two is that if I'm going to be helping others to also live a better life, I must listen to them and understand from them what is it they need in life. So listening to others, we don't do this. We are taught to speak well, to win debates, maybe write well, convey, but not to listen to others. And unless I listen to someone else, I won't know what that person's aspirations are. I won't even know what that person's capabilities are, which could be part of our solution to what we have to get done. So learn to listen deeply, especially to people who are not like yourself. We do have conferences where we, amongst lawyers maybe about law, and amongst business people about business, to people like ourselves. But do we ever listen to people not like ourselves and listen deeply? Do Hindus listen to Muslims in India? Do Muslims listen to Hindu anymore in India? Are we listening? Rich to poor? Are the rich countries listening to us, poor countries, saying, gosh, we of course care for the climate more than you do because we've already been harmed. You've suddenly woken up. Now you're telling us the solution. You didn't know the solution and we knew it all along. Let us tell you what it is. And you can help us with all the money that you've taken over from us through your technologies and colonialization. And let us do the solutions that are good for you too. And you can learn from us. Let's reverse it. Rather than us learning from you, you learn from us. So we can learn from humbler people, poorer people than we are, because they really know how to be resilient. With little, they survive and they're quite happy, surprisingly. We rich people tend to be less happy than some poorer people. So we can learn about life and living life if we learn to listen to people not like ourselves. So that's the second skill that we must all have definitely in our lives. And law should be, I think, framed not to be a technical matter, but has to be an ethical matter.
That's wonderful, Arun. We are reaching the fag end of this discussion. And as one of my favorite authors, Ernest Hemingway once said famously, that writing is the easiest thing to do. All you have to do is sit with a typewriter and bleed. That's a very emotional perspective of writing. That I bring it up because if I may request you, can we possibly conclude this with one of your poems?
Well, thank you so much for asking, because as you were speaking, and I mentioned listening at the end, We talked about the climate change and also the divisiveness that's coming because of this technology called social media. Rather than uniting all of us, enabling all of us to listen to each other, it's created far more divisions, far more hate, and far more anger and violence around the world. So this is my poem called Listening. It's from this book, Listening to My Mind, a Zen-like diversion, and like this haiku. It's time to press the pause button, put our smartphones on silent, shut out the tweets, trolls, and sound bites, and stop the windmills in our minds. It's time to listen to the whispers in the trees, to the caring in our hearts, and most of all, to the voices of people not like us. Then we will learn and find solutions for living together on our shared earth. So thank you.
That message is the perfect note to end this on. And thank you so much for accepting this invitation and giving us this very insightful and the poem was the perfect end. We can really just, with that message, we can summarize this perfectly. Thank you so much, Arun.
Thank you so much, Karthik.
May I just hand this back to Himakshi then?
Wow, sir, it was amazing. At the outset, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude on behalf of Orange City Literature Fest to Mr. Arun Maira and Advocate Karthik Shukla for joining us today. I was hearing your session and truly speaking, I found myself amazed at the things you told, and I will also try to practice those things in my life. We wish we get to hear you both again and be equally enlightened as we all are today. And for my GeoMassive audience, I'm sure after witnessing this conversation, you all are taking home an enriched version of yourself, just as I will. Thank you for joining us today. Until I see you again, this is Amanshi Kandhari signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik, Himakshi. Thank you. Bye.
Welcome to Rai Soni Group, a vision beyond.